Hey, good morning, Horizon Church. um, Actually, it's pretty late at night, but realized I'm going to be gone next week, so I wanted to get some recorded morning devotionals. And I thought several of you have commented on the elk antlers that are hanging in the back of my wall that you see every day, and I thought I give you a fun little story, a little bit of education about antlers. I know that this is not a big deal, but and then talk a little bit about kind of a practical application about growth. But I know that most of you know that antlers grow every year. That animals, deer, I think they're called cervids, uh, deer like moose, caribou, reindeer, elk, white-tailed deer, all of those animals will grow and lose their antlers every year. Are not these are not actually horns. Sometimes people mistakenly call them horns. Horns do not fall off and regrow every year. Animals that have horns, like cows and bison and sheep and bighorn sheep and goats, horns have a bony center. There is a bone in the center, but they grow every year. There's a layer of keratin. Keratin, it's like your fingernail. What is your fingernails are made out of? There's a keratin sheath on the outside of horns, and although they grow, they do not fall off every year like antlers do. And all deer, all cervids have these. For the most part, it's only males that grow antlers, with the exception of reindeer, what we call reindeer. Caribou also sometimes are called. There's a there's a mix up there, but caribou, both or the reindeer, both males and females, although the females' antlers tend to be smaller. They're the only ones in the cervid or the deer family where the females also grow antlers, but for the most part, it's just the males that grow these things. And this is amazing when you think about it. This is now solid bone, this antler, solid bone. And they grow every year from what's called the pedicle, and that's this little spot right here. There's a spot on the skull of a deer, and you can kind of see it's somewhat rounded. And every year that pedicle will restart. Usually in the spring, they restart growing antlers. And these antlers, as you know, do you know that these are the fastest growing bone on the planet? Nothing else grows as fast. If you think about the fact that this antler, this bone, started growing in the spring, and in 4 to 5 months, it's completed. The same with that elk rack up there. That elk rack up there, which is huge. It's if you ever get into my office, like I don't know, 50 pounds. I forget what it weighs, but it's huge. All of that bone grew within a 4 to 5 month period of time. They will grow several inches a day at their peak. It's an incredible rapid growth rate. What happens is, starting at the pedicle here, they actually antlers will grow from the tip. In other words, it's not the whole thing that's growing. The tip will just grow and get longer and longer, and then it gets its characteristic shape, which is pretty much determined by genetics. The shape of an antler. They can break as they're growing. They're covered when an antler is growing. It is covered in what's called velvet, and velvet is this. It's skin. It's fuzzy skin. It looks and feels very much like velvet. Um, but it is very rich in blood supply. A lot of blood vessels are flowing in that velvet, because for something to grow like this, it takes a ton of nutrients, um, which is a kind of a lesson we'll talk about. But ton of nutrients that need to supply this massive growth rate that's happening, growing, an inch in some cases, like elk. I think it's elk that have the fastest growing of all the cervids, all the deer, the fastest growing antlers in the deer kingdom. I mean, when you look at it, I mean, those things have to grow a couple inches every day to reach that peak within a short period of time. But so there's a very rich blood supply on the external of these things. A little bit, I think, on the at the base in the bone as well. But for the most part, the blood supply is on the outside, covered in velvet. And if a deer will, they're very careful with their antlers when they're growing. If a deer bumps his antler against a tree branch or something when it's growing, it will bleed profusely, and you can damage it. And sometimes you'll see elk with like, or not, well, elk too, but you'll see deer with deformed antlers or broken antlers. Sometimes they'll get broken when they're growing. But after 4 to 5 months of growing, as they grow through the tip like this, they the blood supply gets shut off really, and at the tip where it's growing, what's growing is not bone; it's actually cartilage, and it's soft. So as it grows, it is cartilage that is growing, and then once it once it reaches its peak and the blood supply kind of is turned off by hormones and by light, etc., by the amount of daylight, that blood supply shuts off, and the velvet will shed. And it's often, sometimes when you see it, I've seen deer at that particular time, and their antlers are red from the blood, and it's kind of an ugly thing. But the velvet is shed, and then it all the cartilage hardens and becomes bone, and it's just solid bone. And a deer will carry that around for the late summer, fall, and winter, and then they'll lose it again in late winter, early spring. They'll lose it again, and then very soon after they lose it, it'll start that growing process all over again. And because of genetics and because of the way it works, there's a process. This is a mature deer. This one for Pennsylvania, but usually a deer, its antlers the first couple of years of its life will get bigger every year. It might start out with just a spike on its head. It's when it's a year and a half old, and then next year get bigger. And by the time a deer is around Pennsylvania, you don't see deer that live that long, but a deer will mature 4, 5, 6 years of age, roughly. And in those years, if he has good genetics and if he has a good food supply, his antlers will be at their peak. And then if they keep living, usually antler growth starts to decline after that. And deer don't live, like somewhat like dogs in terms of their life cycle. A deer that's taken care of, that isn't hunted, things like that, might live, from what I've seen and heard, 9, 10 years. But for the most part in the wild, they'll decline, and their antler growth will decline as well. But it's a fascinating thing. The people have wondered, the obvious use for antlers. You may know it during the rut, we call it. There's a season of the year when the female deer are ready to be bred. They go into estrus, I think the term is, and that's in the fall. And usually the deer. So one time a year that the male deer, just really act stupid. To be honest with you, that's when a lot of them are killed. That's on the highways and by hunters because they're caution. A deer. This deer, for example, we found this. This is a mature deer. We found this in our fields at our farm. Never ever saw this deer in daylight. Didn't even know he was there. Didn't even know he was living there because he was so cautious. But during the rut, deer throw caution to the winds and they start chasing doe around. So they use their antlers for fighting, and that's what's well known. But there's actually a bunch of uses. The antlers function a couple different practical things. One, believe it or not, antlers serve as air conditioning. Believe it or not, in the summer months. There's such an enormous blood supply to the antlers that they feel warm, and the male deer will get rid of a lot of heat in the summer through their antlers. It's heat is just lost through antler growth, so it keeps the deer itself. It keeps the male deer a couple degrees cooler in the summer than they would otherwise. Of course, they play a role in sex selection, mate selection, and from studies, that scientists tend to think there are two things. One, apparently there is something to the females who are being more receptive to deer with bigger headgear, um, and it seems to just to be some kind of a genetic way of a female deer recognizing that's a healthier buck, a healthier male with better DNA, better genes when they see more impressive headgear on the deer. So there seems to be some of that. So it's air conditioning, sex selection, and of course deer use these. They fight. If you live in an area where there's a good buck to doe ratio, in other words, a lot of areas in Pennsylvania because buck are hunted and killed, um, the a lot more doe than there are buck. Um, but if you live in an area where there's a lot of buck and they start fighting for the doe, those fights can get really, really vicious, and they'll kill each other. The buck will actually kill each other with their antlers. Same with elk, etc. So they use them for that. They use them for fighting. But what we also know is that the deer will use these for protection. They did some studies in Yellowstone when wolves were reintroduced, and they discovered that in Yellowstone, the wolves were significantly less likely to pursue elk with headgear still attached, with their antlers still attached, or in herds where there were herds of elk with a high number of the bull elk with their antlers. The wolves were less likely to attack, so it's good protection. Believe it or not, this is also used in areas where there's a lot of snow. The cervids, the deer, will use these to move snow out of the way to get down to get down to food. So they're also used for shoveling snow and getting down to food. And the other thing that's odd about these is they did some studies with moose, and moose, again, their cervids. Moose lose their paddles every year, their horns. And if you can picture moose, their paddles are wider, and they're you got their ears up here and they're wider. They actually discovered that for moose, the paddles function like hearing aids. Believe it or not, they are good for catching sound and bouncing sound up to a moose's ear. So they're a moose paddle, a moose antler, is good for hearing. And then the last thing that we know of that they're really good for, as far as nature, is great source of calcium. Every year when these fall off, the critters in the woods will just nibble at them. In fact, the second elk that I shot, I brought home, and it was the antlers were sitting in my backyard. I didn't take care of it right away. Not this one, but another one's in my house. And squirrels found it. And the squirrels started chewing off at each of the points. And when the squirrels discover something like that, there's something about them that tells them, hey, this is good, I need this. So the critters will start chewing on these because of the calcium and the mineral supply. And so every year when these get dropped in the forest, these antlers get dropped in the forest, they become a great supply of calcium and minerals for critters. So just a quick comment, an application about you and I, people of faith. There's an interesting thing with antlers. This rapid growth, this fastest growth of bone anywhere, but it makes a huge demand on deer, on white-tailed deer, to feed this rapid growth in their antlers. The male deer in particular they need to eat a lot of minerals, and they need a lot of them. So growth comes at a cost, and you can actually see in areas where there are guys, there are people, hunters in particular, who are really interested in growing big headgear on their deer. So they'll put out mineral licks, and they'll feed the deer with corn that is fortified with vitamins, just to help the deer grow antlers. But you can actually, it's fun. Deer can be very selective, and they have food that they like at certain times of the year and in certain areas. And a lot of that has to do with not only the food supply, what's growing, but I guess just as a part of the evolutionary process, whatever you want to call it, they have learned that at times of the year they need minerals and they need lots of nutrients. And there's a great lesson here, to grow headgear like this. It doesn't just happen. It takes a supply of food. Great lesson for you and I about growing. And we finished a series on growth not long ago, and we talked about the goal to the biblical growth, to grow in every way more and more like Christ. But same with you and I, growth demands resources. Growth doesn't happen without resources. Now, of course, we know that God is our ultimate resource. We know that God's Spirit is helping us to grow. But you and I need to be supplied with the resources itself in order to grow. And those resources don't come to us automatically. And if we don't get the food, if we don't get the nourishment we need to grow, kind of like an antler, you don't grow impressive headgear. There's a big demand for growth, and it comes through some of the ones that you would expect through things like scripture and prayer. But people and things like accountability are also resources that we need. I've been talking this morning. I met with someone that I meet with pretty regularly, about every 2 to 3 weeks, and we are always working on a certain agenda, what it is that's going on in our life in areas that we want to grow, and that's a resource for me because it inspires in me the need to, if I have something that an area that I'm want to be growing in, then I have to pay attention to that area. So, for example, one of the areas that I'm working on this year is just being more deliberate, trying to think about what it is that needs attention in my life, and then actually giving it attention rather than being haphazard, and just being a little bit more focused on things. So, so growth, in the same way that an antler takes a lot of nourishment to grow, it's the same with you and I. Growth has to come from nourishment, and it comes from the basics, things like prayer, reading the Bible, but also some things that we don't think about all that much, and that is our relationships and time together, time for reflection, quiet time when we're interacting with God. And so as you think about areas in your life where you may want to be growing, you may want to ask yourself, well, how am I nourishing that growth? What am I putting into my life that will enable me to grow in that particular area? Obviously it's the Holy Spirit's job to grow us and to transform us. But as I said, He won't do it without our cooperation, and our cooperation involves providing the nourishment for that to happen. So, fun little lesson on antlers and how they work, and the fascinating lesson on antlers, but then also the implications for us and about our growing. And I hope that you'll give some thought to how are you nourishing your plan to growth in your life. So let me pray for us, and then I'm going home to bed. It's late, so let me pray. God, thank you for the prospect that we have of growing as human beings. We grow in a lot of different ways, but we also grow in our faith, and that's important to us because that kind of growing has a ripple effect in so many areas. It impacts how we relate to other people, it impacts how we navigate the world, it impacts how we deal with our own worry and anxiety and our fears. So God, I pray that you would be helping us to grow, to be more and more like Christ in every way. And I pray, God, that at least for today, that this will inspire in us some thinking about how are we providing nourishment for you, for your Spirit to do your work of transforming us. Pray, God, that we'd be people who are investing in our growth. And thank you, God, for the work that you do to transform us and to change us and grow us. So thank you very much, and love you guys all, and hope you're having a good. This is probably Tuesday that you're watching this, so love you all, and see you Thursday.